Hello and welcome to Cinema Eclectica, part of the Geek Show podcast network. We are the Geek Show's dedicated movie podcast. This week I've been joined by Mick.
Hello.
And Tim.
Hi.
Hello there. And today we've got a very mysterious film of the week that answers a number of questions, not least of which is, what was the point of the Cloverfield paradox? Because it's the film that Julius Anoa has made after cashing in his credibility and, more importantly, his bank check on that Netflix project. It's Luce, starring Naomi Watts, Calvin Harrison Jr., Octavia Spencer, and Tim Roth. Now, this is a film that not everyone has seen, am I right?
Yes. I haven't seen it.
Yes.
It's just me.
And I haven't seen it.
You alone have seen it, Graham.
So
I have seen it.
As a representative sample of the population, approximately 33% of cinema goers have seen it.
Yes. You alone have your finger on the pulse, Graham. As usual, to be honest.
Well, feel free to quiz me on it, but I think if you had decided to pretend to have seen Luce, it would be in keeping with the themes of the film, and in many ways I regret not becoming an improv podcast just for this.
Right.
Because it's one of those films which has a lead character, title character indeed, whose motivations are slippery, whose honesty is questionable. So it's the story of a high school student called Luce, who's Eritrean born, American raised. He's been adopted by two white suburban parents played by Naomi Watts and Tim Roth. And it starts when his teacher, played by Octavia Spencer, calls Watts' character in to talk to her about an essay Luce has written about the Marxist anti-colonial philosopher Franz Fanon. I know this is a big blockbuster start to a movie, right?
That's the kind of pitch you put that in the trailer and that'll really pack them in.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if you've got the tagline, an essay that they don't like, that's, in high school, no one can see your writing.
Whereas teacher, Mrs. Wilson, Octavia Spencer's character, thinks that the essay essentially incites violence. And after it was produced, she checks his locker and finds some illegal fireworks in there, which he insists are the product of his locker being used by his friends as well. And from this, it sort of unravels into a movie where it's quite hard to work out what anyone's agenda is. Luce seems initially to be a pretty straightforward guy in the wrong place at the wrong time. But when Mrs. Wilson talks to him about the fireworks, he responds with a slightly creepily pitched speech about how much he loves the 4th of July. He loves the ideals behind it. He loves fighting for freedom. He loves the fireworks too, which it's impossible to tell whether he's just really awkward and trying too hard or whether this is some sort of veiled reference to what he's not supposed to know is going on yet.
Yeah.
So it's adapted from a play, which I am not familiar with, but played by J.C. Lee. And I mean, what expectations do you have when you see a film that's adapted from a play?
Well, I mean, I guess one of the dangers you've always got with an adaptation of a play for cinema is the static nature of a play. Just the very physical limitations of the stage tend to mean that you've got 1, 2, maybe 3 at a push locations, much of which has to be done by the audience's imagination. And the danger is always to keep it that static.
Yeah.
Yeah, although the other thing you could achieve is to do a kind of slightly superficial adaptation where all you really do is move the action out into the street or on a bus or something, despite the fact that really has no relevance to what's being said.
Yeah.
It's basically ended up thinking, well, your play would have worked reasonably well on the radio, and then you've arbitrarily just put a sort of screensaver up on the screen while we listen to it.
Oh, yeah, I have a big hatred for these sort of things. They're like, oh, we're adapting Shakespeare. How do we make it cinematic? Helicopter crash in the first scene, I guess. That'll do.
I see you've seen Michael Bay's Shakespeare.
Yeah, I know. I saw that script. I saw that script for that adaptation of Timon of Athens you wrote, Mick, and I wasn't impressed.
What? Not even with the robots? So, but I think.
But does Luce commit that?
I think the other the way that a cinema adaptation of a stage play can really bring that to life is you've got the advantage that you can really focus in on the proper emotions without hammy overacting. You can focus on those micro expressions and really see the torment on someone's face.
Yeah. I mean, in terms of the locations, it's funny because when you said it's probably only going to have like 2 or 3 locations, I immediately thought, oh yeah, this probably does. But it didn't strike me until you said that because it feels fairly natural. I mean, a film about a kid who has a sort of a schism between his home life and his school life is going to naturally have 2 main locations, right?
Okay, yeah.
It's home and school.
Yeah, and you're possibly going to get some sort of character development pieces in, like the shopping mall with mum and dad or something like that.
And there's a bit of that. Yeah, there's a memorable trip out to get frappuccinos.
Well, why not?
Yeah. Don't remember saying that when we were reviewing Avengers Endgame.
No. I think that was in the director's cut.
Yes. Yeah, they didn't want it to go to 4 hours. The thing that I found kind of surprising is for someone who has directed a big special effects picture, I mean, not a special effects picture that anyone liked, but still, Julius Onua is not that much of a stylist. I mean, it doesn't. I don't necessarily mean sort of fireworks as style. I think limitations can be style as well. I think the fact that, say, Werner Herzog rarely, if ever, uses close-ups is a point of his style.
Yeah.
But with Onua, I never really got a sense on what he was doing other than making sure the dramatic bits were, where the camera was pointing.
Oh, right, okay, yeah.
It does look visually kind of meat and potatoes.
Right.
Oh, in a way that actually kind of damages it, you think, really, or diminishes the drama?
I mean, I think it essentially works. I want to make that clear. I don't feel like I regret my time watching it, but I also don't want to pretend that I didn't spend a lot of time thinking, man, if Steve McQueen had directed this, it would be incredible.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah.
Someone who knows how to make a kind of austere, restrained style look really punchy.
What's the actual kind of tone of it exactly? I mean, is there a sort of black comedy element in there, sort of absurdist?
Kind of less than you'd think, really. It's, I mean, I hate saying this phrase because it's only ever used pejoratively now, but it's kind of an issue movie.
Oh, okay. Yeah, well, that wouldn't bother me. I just wondered whether it was that you could naturally put in something slightly kind of, almost kind of farcical, really, about the fact the teacher is rummaging through the locker looking for stuff and finds something.
Yeah,
so
it could work reasonably well as a satire, but that's not the kind of movie that Onua's made.
Yeah. How far does the situation escalate then?
Oh, pretty damn far.
Okay.
I think it's fair to say. I mean, it doesn't get past the confines of the sort of house and the school. It doesn't become like a major international incident or anything, but it does become a very pressurized and aggressive situation. I think
no one calls in the National Guard then.
No, it doesn't have like police convoy from the end of the day shall come turning up.
I was going to say that Luce just goes on the run and is pursued by the federal marshals or something across the country.
For criminal essay writing.
Yeah.
Well, actually, Tim, it gets worse than that. Because I've looked up the Wikipedia page just so that I had some background. And apparently, Luce goes on a run where his face contorts in rage.
I'm not sure I could cope with that. I think I'd have to leave the cinema at that point.
Yeah, that is mentioned on the BBFC advice, so they don't just spring that on you.
Right, yeah.
Well,
how could we be so cynical about this movie, Mick, not having seen it?
I don't know. I think you're doing a good job. Don't do yourself down.
Okay, yeah.
This film contains scenes of mild peril and face contortion.
Yes. Yeah, all those documentaries about gurning contests in Yorkshire got a similar thing.
Yeah.
But tonally, yeah, I want to sort of go back to that tone thing a bit, because one of the things that I did like about it, there is a score which I now realise why it's good, because it's co-composed by Jeff Barrow from Portishead, which
Okay.
always a good sign. But the score kind of pivots weirdly between this kind of minimalist, not quite Philip Glassy, but in that ballpark kind of piece, to this really heavy kind of bassy trap sound. And it becomes as though the score has the same split personality as Luce does, because he often talks about how uncomfortable he is being an academic high achiever and being held up as an example in a way that he finds to be quite racialized. You know, he's the good black kid who's meant to show the other black kids that they don't have to deal drugs or anything. And it's as if the score itself is kind of seesawing between this very academic and very urban tone in a way that I think works a lot better than it should. It's like there's no cohesion to it, but that's the point.
Yeah, I mean, is that the extent to which it's an issue movie? It's an issue. The issue is race, really, in the context like an American school, I guess, or a.
Yeah, an American school.
Is it race or is it more culture? Because there is this emphasis on Luce being a child soldier before coming to America.
Yeah, and that is carefully seeded in. There's a couple of mentions of it, and I think they are rightly cautious about using that as too much of an excuse or an explanation. But I think, Mick, you've sort of put your finger on something big that I like about the movie, in that I can imagine a very bad version of this where the teacher is a sort of middle-class white lady who reads this essay about Franz Fanon and Pan-Africanism and just freaks out and decides that this guy's Al-Qaeda or something stupid. Whereas in this, it's Octavia Spencer, who is, of course, an African-American actress, who plays a teacher who works in a classroom which is festooned with pictures of Cesar Chavez and Martin Luther King, and is in every other way a racial exemplar, but her experience is specifically African American, whereas Luce's is African and also American. And it turns out that's enough of a wedge to drive a conflict between them. I don't think I've seen that in a film before.
Yeah, I see what you mean. It sounds like the kind of thing where it could have been handled extremely clumsily or just almost just kind of ignored that distinction.
But yeah, so cast-wise, I mean, you can't complain about it, can you? It's a terrific cast. Spencer, I think, she does a few things where she doesn't really get much sort of meat to chew on, but every time someone gives her a role that she can really dig into, I think in particular her role in Ryan Coogler's Fruitvale Station, which is astonishing. I mean, she's so great in that. And Tim Roth and Naomi Watts too, both of whom I thought were strong. I mean, Tim Roth's always good news, isn't he?
Yeah. Is Tim Roth British or is he American?
He is British.
Yeah, I thought he was British. Yeah.
And Naomi Watts, of course, was born in England but raised in Australia, like a Commonwealth version of the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air.
Yes. I think that reference is probably going to go over the heads of our of our younger listeners. Actually, no, it's probably not.
No, they're obsessed with Fresh
Prince
of Bel-Air on the internet. Yeah.
Actually,
it may in fact be too modern a reference for
the younger generation see that as something of a retro reference to a time when Will Smith was popular.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, Ang Lee was betting big on that being a thing that people would be very excited to see at the cinema.
Yeah.
But yeah, Naomi Watts has had a bit of bad luck with some of these mum roles that she's been doing. Obviously, her greatest role as someone's mum is the harassed wife of Dougie Jones, who's been replaced by an FBI agent from another dimension in Twin Peaks: The Return.
Oh, yeah, okay, yeah.
Everyday household problems that I think we can all relate to.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, well, that ticks off the contrived Twin Peaks reference for this week. Well done.
But yeah, I mean, otherwise, I've been baffled sometimes by her choice of roles. I mean, I watched The Book of Henry this year, and boy, I mean, look forward to more talk about that on the end of year show, I think, because
it's not just bad, but so bizarrely misjudged, supposedly, that you can't even understand how anyone. It's almost like a well-made example of something that should never have existed in the first place.
Yeah, it feels like some kind of diabolical puzzle toy where to fix it you would have to say, oh, well, to make this bit work, you'd have to get rid of that. Oh, but that bit there would then clash with this. And in the end, I think it unlocks the Lamont configuration and the Cenobites come to it.
Yeah. So there seems to be an element of a coming-of-age movie in Luce as well. There seems to be some hijinks involving Harriet, Stephanie, and Amy.
Right, yeah, that's boy, hijinks is not the word. That goes down a bit of a dark path.
Okay.
Again, part of the sort of business with calling it an issue movie is that saying that it then goes into like issues of date rape and sexual assault on campus makes you think, oh, right, good, it wasn't loaded enough with headliney stuff already. But again, handles it well, I think. Dodges the pitfalls. Very strong performance by Andrea Bang as Stephanie Kim, who may or may not be Luce's girlfriend, depends on who exactly is telling the truth about this. And I suppose when you talk about coming-of-age stories, every coming-of-age story is kind of a story about working out who you are, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that's exactly what this is about. It's just that the stakes are much higher.
Yeah, it's got much kind of darker background behind it, or at least than most of those you might expect. Not just anxiety over normal things.
Yeah, it's not about getting a date for prom and sort of worrying about your exams. I mean, there's a bit of that, but it's really not the main thing.
How much of the really dark stuff is there in the background, like the child soldier sort of stuff? Do you actually get that as flashback, or is it left?
Thankfully, no.
Okay.
Which again feels like a sensible choice, not just because it might be, a bit too extreme for the rest of the film, but also it doesn't even have that detailed a reference to it. You are allowed to fill in a backstory for Luce, which is as violent as you think makes sense with his character now.
Yeah. I mean, it's the sort of thing, on the other hand, if you show the viewer more directly that kind of extreme material when the characters haven't seen it, you might just end up detaching the viewer from the characters a bit.
Oh, God, yeah, it's a real risk. I mean, I think the only film about that, I haven't seen that film Monos about child soldiers, which is out now. That's supposed to be very good. But I think there's a film from Burkina Faso. Yeah, I know I'm heading straight into self-parody. There's a film from Burkina Faso called The Night of Truth, which is a sort of a semi-fantastical version of the insurgency they had in that country, which deals with issues like that and is very good. But I'm not sure I would trust a director who hadn't lived in Burkina Faso for all their life to really handle it sensitively.
Yeah.
I suppose the thing that I haven't mentioned, which is the thing that more than anything hangs it together, is how really, really good Kelvin Harrison Jr. is as Luce. I mean, he is absolutely fantastic. He's had sort of fairly prominent supporting roles in some buzzed about indies. It Comes at Night by Trey Edward Schultz, Monsters and Men, which I think Aidan and Rob were talking about on the show a bit back, though I haven't seen myself. I hadn't knowingly seen him in anything. He has a part in 12 Years a Slave, but it looks like it's an unbelievably small part.
Okay, yeah.
So this is like his major coming out performance for me. And he's uncommonly good, because things like that fireworks speech that he gives to Octavia Spencer have to be open to a multiplicity of different readings. It has to work for whatever motivation you think Luce might have in saying it. And as the film goes on and his character gets more kind of disturbing and hard to understand, he has to keep doing more and more of that stuff, and it's uncommonly good. It's really great. But yeah, I think that about sort of covers what I wanted to say for it. In terms of recommendations, I mean, anytime I watch, you complained about my shoehorned in Twin Peaks reference.
Yeah.
Wait for my shoehorned in Patricia Highsmith reference.
Okay, yes. That's the next thing down the checklist.
Yeah, anyone playing bingo with this show should, I think, have a full house by the end of this. Whenever I think about films about disturbingly blank young men of incomprehensible motivation, part of my mind always goes to the talented Mr. Ripley.
Wow, okay.
In either version, obviously, there's the famous version with Matt Damon as Ripley. There's also a French film from, I think, the 50s, 40s called Purple Noon with Alain Delon as Ripley, which is also very good indeed.
I'd not come across that one. I have to admit, having the way you described Luce, wouldn't have thought the talented Mr. Ripley would be a particular close point of comparison, but okay, yeah.
I think it's more in the kind of way that the central character becomes fascinating despite giving nothing of himself away. Like, obviously, Ripley is a criminal. Luce may or may not be a criminal, so that's a point of difference. But they still have this kind of unnervingly blank slate quality. The other thing is, the last time I saw a young actor give a performance as a troubled young man with a mysterious background that was as good as Kelvin Harrison Jr.'s, it was Andrew Garfield in the TV film Boyer, which I think was the first lead role he had. It was probably the first thing I saw him in. And that was fantastic. That was by John Crowley, who went on to direct Brooklyn, among other things. And it's sort of, I mean, it's not based on it, but the central device is inspired by the scandal over the killers of James Bulger being released from prison under new identities. And Garfield's character in Boyer has a similar thing. He's been let out of prison after committing a very terrible crime as a child, given a new identity, and he lives under this sort of twin crisis, these twin burdens of, will people find out who I am, and what if I can't escape who I am myself? And he's fantastic in it, and it's a very comparable performance to Harrison's.
Hello nerds, my name's Josie Long and you're listening to The Geek Show, and I'm going to get your lunch money. I'm not, I really am not. I'm not a bully. If anything, I'm probably worse than you, at least. Anyway, I've ruined it.
So if you're enjoying what you're listening to, you can find us on Twitter at TGS_The Geek Show. That's our parent network. If you go to thegeekshow.co.uk, you can find our site with our written reviews. We're also on Patreon at www.patreon.com/The Geek Show. We have new reward tiers there. Please do check it out. We're on Facebook. Just search for The Geek Show. So yes, if you do go over to geekshow.co.uk, we've got some new written reviews over there. The Classic Film Kid has been reviewing La Cabina, the infamously terrifying Spanish short. And Aidan has a review of the new second run Blu-ray of The Emperor's Naked Army Marches On, which I will also be reviewing next week. But before that, we've got some off the shelf. And we technically probably have some off the shelf.
Mick, you're going first with your box set.
I was just waiting for some kind of a queue up.
Apologies. Yeah.
All right, Mick, what have you been watching this month?
I've been watching,
or just today,
thanks to our friends at Eureka, 3/5 of the Fuller at Fox box set.
Yes, I think the reason for the 3/5, we should say, it's not because the package is water damaged or anything like that.
Yeah.
It's because they have sent us, I think, Fixed Bayonets and
have they?
Pick Up on South Street before.
Right.
Yeah, well, I've definitely done Fixed Bayonets, which I
Yeah.
highly recommend.
I
Very
think
good war
this is the
film.
thing. I think the reason that they got those two as a separate release is because they're probably the best of Fuller's work.
Okay.
So the 3/5 that I received to review were House of Bamboo, which is a film noir starring Robert Stack, and a delightful sort of often missed performance from DeForest Kelley, otherwise known as Dr. Bones McCoy from the original Star Trek series. The reason it's not really known by that many people that he's in this film is because the print that did the rounds on the TV between its release in the 1950s and now, or the re-release in the 90s, I should say, because they used a pan and scan print. And because he's either on the far left of the shot or the far right of the shot, everybody thought he just did a cameo at the end.
Oh, that is bleak.
But once they did a full 35mm restoration print in the 90s, it turned out he was in the entire movie all along.
I wonder how many other movies that could be applied to. He might be in all kinds of things that we're unaware of.
Everybody completely unaware of the fact that he was pulling the sledge in Citizen Kane.
This is why Wes Anderson gets his actors to stand right in the middle of the frame. It's so this never happens.
Yeah.
So, House of Bamboo, it's a film noir. It's set in Japan. A military train is robbed of its cargo of guns, ammunition, and smoke bombs. And the Americans send in an agent who's called Eddie Spanier to investigate. And there's a love story with the thief's wife, Mariko. There's espionage, there's double crossing, there's all the stuff you would expect from a film noir, and it's a perfectly serviceable film noir. And that is the running theme of the 3 films I've reviewed. They are all perfectly serviceable examples of their genre.
Right.
That sounds in a way like a kind of grim assessment, really. I mean, there's no surprises whatsoever.
None of these are, the film noir. It's not The Third Man. The Western. It's not High Noon or True Grit.
Yeah.
The Hell and High Water is not Das Boot or anything like that. None of them are awful. None of them are terrible. They're just good examples.
Yeah.
But where Sam Fuller scores highly in these films, and bear in mind, my favourite bit that came with the press release for this box set is it's Fuller at Fox, 5 films that he released with 20th Century Fox, is how he came to be working at Fox.
Yeah.
So he'd had a little bit of success with some low-budget war films and westerns, and suddenly the big studios started throwing offers of money at him.
Yeah.
Except for Fox. Fox went up to him and said, "Come with us, Sam, because we make better films."
It's a ballsy pitch. It could very easily backfire.
It could indeed. But of course, the move to Fox got him the ability to work with CinemaScope.
Yeah.
And I think where Sam Fuller scores highly in these 3 films is he's a director who appreciates the power of CinemaScope.
Well, unless he's shunting DeForest Kelley off to the side of it.
To be fair, that was the thing. It's the buggers who put it out on TV years later that stumped DeForest Kelley's. God damn it, he's an actor.
Yeah, the other way to look at it is perhaps he deliberately put him to the left and right to provide a...
Yeah, he was dissatisfied with his performance.
Yeah, it was a get-out in the event that you needed to trim him off the sides. It will be possible.
But what the CinemaScope technology allows Fuller to do with these, because they're still, for all the fact that he's got the power of Fox behind him, they're still relatively low-budget movies. But it looks like they're done on an epic scale.
Yeah.
You know, it's like that. It's like the difference between watching an episode of The Saint on TV and then seeing a Bond movie.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, you really get that sense of scale difference that the budget and the technology allows. So when we see shots of Paris in Hell and High Water, or we see shots of Japan in House of Bamboo, we don't need lots of people speaking in French or people speaking in Japan. We don't need a subtitle going, Japan, 1947.
Yes.
Because the CinemaScope allows us to drink in all the panoramic glory and splendour of the various scenes around Japan that we cut to show how we get from A to B.
Yeah.
And this is particularly true in Hell and High Water at the beginning, where Richard Widmark's character is being recruited by this international group of concerned citizens to investigate a nuclear explosion. We know we're in Paris because, yes, we drive past the Eiffel Tower, but we do exactly that. We drive past the Eiffel Tower. We don't have a massive sign saying, welcome to Paris.
Not just an establishing shot of the Eiffel Tower and then returning immediately to a
studio lot in
studio set
in Burbank,
in Los Angeles.
So you know that you've got that to play with. And actually, funnily enough, although it works really beautifully in setting up the scenes for where they are within Hell and High Water, it probably detracts a little bit from Hell and High Water, because essentially what you've got is the story of 28 people, one of which is an attractive female scientist, trapped on a less than seaworthy submarine.
Yeah.
But the fact that it's shot in CinemaScope makes it look like the roomiest submarine ever developed. I mean, it makes Captain Nemo's Nautilus look porky. Yeah.
So it's like Das Boot, but extremely spacious. You have room to stretch your legs.
This is it. It's huge. It goes on for ages. The sort of drama and tension that builds up on the submarine is somehow lessened. But when we cut back to the bomber falling out of the sky and the nuclear explosion itself that sets everything off, and all the shots of the island where the base is, where the miscreants with the nuclear weapons are, that it all works with. I think possibly my biggest disappointment out of this set, and again, it's a very good Western, is 40 Guns. Because in the press release we got, it describes it as 40 Guns, the Western with a feminine twist.
Right.
Okay.
Which you're thinking, well, that's way ahead of its time for 1957.
Yeah.
A feminist Western? What the hell are you thinking for?
Does it say feminist twist or feminine twist?
Feminist.
Oh, okay, wow. Yeah, all right.
Now, I can see why they might try and spin that yarn. Because effectively you've got a Western version of the 40 Thieves, but they're led by Barbara Stanwyck.
I'm sold already.
Yeah, sounds pretty good to me.
Right. Now, the thing is, she turns in a marvellous performance as this no-nonsense matriarch of a band of bent officials and robbers and rustlers and things like that. And she plays like... She's kind of like a Western godmother, if you like. And she plays it with all the sort of gravitas and hard-nosed businesswoman type figure that you'd expect from an actress of Stanwyck, who by this time is a fading star, and is moving more into those mature matriarchal roles. And she's such a strong and fine woman who, the minute the dashing young marshal walks into town looking for someone, she swoons and falls in love with him.
Right.
Okay. Well, that doesn't sound like such...
And that's why it's disappointing, because up to that point, where she becomes the very archetypal cinema Hollywood 50s definition of a weak and feeble woman, she's actually a really strong lead female character. She's got sassy responses to anyone who goes away.
Actually, she's also she's the one actually in charge of the gang as well. I mean, she's actually the
yeah. She's trying to keep her drunken younger brother in tow. She tries to protect him, and eventually it gets to the point where she realises that he's just a waster, and actually throw him in jail.
Well, it sounds like maybe there was,
or finish him off.
There must have been a sort of gleam of good intention somewhere at the start in that, but obviously they couldn't quite follow it through to the end if it just kind of collapses into a romance plot.
Yeah, and that's it. It's almost like it's that. Yeah, we could make a strong leading woman, but we don't really know how to do that. So what we'll do instead is we'll start off that way, and then we'll write her the way we know how women are, and let her swoon over the dashing young man.
I mean, I've got to admit, I'm not terribly surprised that it turned out to be a bit of a blokey film, because the main thing I know about 40 Guns is that the chapter dealing with this film in Sam Fuller's autobiography, A Third Face, is entitled Stuffed with Phalluses.
Yes.
But again, it's not a terrible film. It's not a bad film. The one thing that was jarring was at one point I did think it was going to turn into a musical,
right?
Along the lines of a Rodgers and Hammerstein or something like that, because
that is a shadow that hangs over the Western as a genre, doesn't it, to some extent?
Yeah, but particularly when someone's walking through town, having come off the dusty road with his comrades, and he's looking for somewhere to go for a bath. As he's approaching the bathhouse, through the beautifully photographed Western town, you can hear someone singing a song. And this scene goes on for about 2 minutes before you actually see that in the bathhouse there's a man with a guitar singing. And at that point, it makes perfect sense. But prior to that, you think, this is an overture to something, isn't it?
Yes.
It either looks diegetic and becomes non, or is it the other way round?
Yeah, it feels like one of those jokes like, Homer walking through the woods in The Simpsons, hearing scary string music and then realising a bus with the Springfield Philharmonics driving past it.
Yeah. It is, it's like that. But the thing is, it's one of those, and it only feels like it because the voice is accompanied by a guitar. So when you actually walk past the guy and you see that he's on a rooftop, because the bathhouse is on a rooftop, it's just a load of tin baths on top of a roof. Yeah.
That's not exactly a bathhouse, is it? It's just a bath on top of a house. It does sound like the kind of thing
it's more of a sort of
I would have interpreted it as a sight gag, really.
Yeah, and it kind of works. You hear the music, you hear the song. He's singing about the woman he's singing about Barbara Stanwyck's character. So it's all kind of tied in, and at that point it works. Later on, however, when he just starts singing, stood next to a tree, and there's still a guitar that you can't see anywhere, it falls apart.
Yes.
So. But yeah, of the three that I've seen, I would say that Hell and High Water and 40 Guns sort of split it 50-50 for the ones I enjoyed the most, for all their flaws. House of Bamboo, it was good. I mean, obviously for me, it had the benefit that it had all the DeForest Kelly that had been lacking from previous viewings.
Yeah.
Probably Fixed Bayonets and Pick Up on South Street are probably the ones that people are going to buy this box set for, and these are your 3 bonus films.
I mean, I'd happy to buy something for 40 Guns, despite what you've just said. It's a Western with a musical element starring Barbara Stanwyck and directed by Sam Fuller. Sold 4 times.
But there's just the 2 musical bits, Graham.
But there's a fair bit of variety in this box set by the sound of it. In fact, you've got a Western, film noir, and some sort of like atomic age thriller, really.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they are, like I say, they're perfectly serviceable movies. The one thing that amazes me with Hell and High Water is that anybody actually went to see it at the cinema.
Yeah.
And only because on this disc they include the trailer. Now,
And
we all know that in a trailer, the producers put the best bits of the film.
Yeah, the sizzle.
The filmic moments that they think people are going to rush to the cinema.
yeah,
Except for Hell and High Water.
what's in the Hell and High Water trailer?
Right. Imagine if the three of us had got together and we'd made a blockbuster movie in the Terminator franchise.
Right.
I mean, they're clearly handing out the franchise to anyone, so it could happen.
Yeah, we can't be.
It could.
We're not near the top of the list, but they might get to us eventually.
Yeah.
And they say to us, what are you going to put in the trailer?
Hmm.
And we say, oh, we're going to have all the good bits. You know, we're going to have the bit where the robot meets the beautiful woman and realises that everything's wrong. We're going to have the bit where the hero realises that it's his destiny to destroy the robot. And we're going to have the bit where the guy turns up naked out of the time thing.
Yeah, okay.
That's what we're going to have in the trailer. And then, just to be different, we're going to get a court artist to draw those scenes and do a pan and zoom version of that.
What?
As the trailer.
And that's the trailer for...
Hell and High Water.
Right, so a sort of reconstruction where there's some legal reason why they couldn't... So basically filming the storyboards for the movie.
Yeah, pretty much. But it's one big storyboard that shows the whole of the movie.
What if all of the actors were
That is-
arrested after making the movie and for legal reasons they cannot be shown?
Yeah.
But bear in mind, right, that this is a movie that opens with a mushroom cloud explosion,
Right.
right?
So it's not starving for spectacle.
No, it's not like someone went, have we got any good bits to put in the trailer? No, right?
Oh.
I mean, going back to the film of the week, something like Luce, I can appreciate that, you know, an editor or a director sits there and goes, oh, what shall I put in?
Yeah, it could be a tough sell.
Yeah, but this has got a mushroom cloud in the first 30 seconds.
Oh dear, that's amazing. I know I said I would probably get this just for 40 guns, but I'm tempted to just
But
get
now you want to see that trailer.
Yeah.
So, yes, listeners, we've lost Mick. Nothing to do with his performance, which I think was jolly good. Just timing issues, really. Mick, if you're listening to this, you did a bang-up job. But we still have more off the shelf to bring you, which I think, Tim, is where you come in, right?
Yes, I have been watching a legendary film adaptation of Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness into a hallucinatory vision of American imperialism in Vietnam.
Oh.
Which one, you ask? I've been watching Apocalypse Now, which we were all told had been perfected in its 2001 Redux version, such that nobody could further improve it.
Yes.
But which in 2019, no, wait for it, in 2019, a Coppola clips now into a new version of the film.
Oh,
Do you see what I did there?
Oh,
I don't quite see what I did there. So, unless you've had your finger entirely off the pulse of pop culture for the last 40 years or 50 years?
40 years, yeah.
40 years, yeah. The last 40 years. This is the famous American war film, originally from 1979, and its director, Francis Coppola, has spent the last 40-odd years Goldilocksing this movie, which is first deciding it was too short
Yeah.
at its original release of 2.5 hours, then deciding it was too long at its Redux release of 3.5 hours 20 years after that, And so another 20 years later-ish, deciding it should be trimmed back to be just right somewhere between the two, which is 3 hours.
Yes, yeah.
And this is out now on an enormous, spectacular new Blu-ray edition. They've gone back and rescanned the original negative Apocalypse Now, pretty much gone as far back as you can go without just reshooting the film.
And
not that we would necessarily have been surprised had that idea, no, been floated.
Yeah.
Based on what we know about Coppola. So I guess I'd be amazed if anyone is kind of unaware of the content of this movie, but essentially it follows an American Special Forces captain who is sent on a secret mission upriver into the Vietnamese jungle to find and kill this mysterious figure called Colonel Kurtz, who seems to have apparently gone insane somewhere sort of behind enemy lines in North Vietnam.
Yeah.
So it goes through a series of bizarre kind of surreal and horrifying encounters with the most astonishing kind of hallucinatory visuals and sound. This is starring Martin Sheen as Captain Willard and Marlon Brando famously as Colonel Kurtz. And it goes quite far from reality, or so it seems. Encounters all this kind of mad aspects of the war, members of the armies on both sides going completely mad, and dives right into the sort of depths of his own psyche and all kinds of types of mania. And I suppose at this point it's kind of a bit superfluous just to re-review Apocalypse Now. I mean, it's astonishing, Whether you want to actually say even the word masterpiece doesn't seem to quite. Yeah.
I would say that if you were not a fan, or if you were on the fence in any way, hearing that there's a new cut that is longer than the original but not as long as Redux is probably not going to make you think, oh, maybe I'll like it this time.
Yeah. But it's one of those movies where I sort of think that the mere idea of kind of liking it, you kind of sit there and the experience of going through it kind of transcends the idea of liking it or disliking it, really. And it captured these qualities so madly for 1979, and technologically it was so far ahead of the curve, really.
Yeah.
Although there is another aspect to this, which we now know that this is a film which includes an astonishing number of helicopters and includes the most kind of deafening sound and frightening visuals.
Yeah.
But this new version of it, supposedly, the final cut as it's called, is apparently supposed to be watched in cinemas which have special equipment for the most kind of base level, the kind of deepest, most resonant sound in order to capture the sound of the helicopter blades as if you were actually standing next to the helicopter and that kind of thing.
I did not.
And I didn't watch this in a cinema with that equipment, probably because there's only about 3 cinemas with that equipment in the world.
Yes.
So it's like, well, I was unable to appreciate that adjustment of sound, but I did not buy. My reaction, by and large, to Apocalypse Now is not that it's too quiet. So we got to revisit really here the changes to say, well, the original version was spectacularly brilliant. On the other hand, there was so much seemingly good material that was kept out of it, probably trimmed out by the studio, that we got 20 years after that, we got the Redux version, an hour longer. But even that was done in a slightly kind of clumsy way. It was reviewed in quite kind of mixed way at the time, of sort of saying, well, you've dumped a load of deleted scenes back in.
Yeah.
And it's the kind of thing where if you'd watched them just on a DVD as deleted scenes, you might have looked at a lot of them and said, yeah, I can see why that was deleted.
I mean,
but also just the sheer idea of adding an hour of material.
I have to admit I am a huge defender of the Redux cut, but yeah, it would be fair to say that most people's attitudes was, what the hell is it with this long scene of some posh French people now?
Oh yeah, I was going to get to the posh French people in a moment, but the other issue is just, whether people have the attention span for it, and partly also just the kind of the structure of the film, because you obviously have a pretty much kind of, I guess you could call it a kind of hero's journey structure, where Captain Willard gets on this boat with his crew and gradually sails upriver and encounters more and more bizarre things, more and more, peculiar encounters that get increasingly strange and horrifying as he journeys seemingly, deeper into Colonel Kurtz's madness, which is manifesting itself in the actual jungle. But the other thing about that aspect is that you could more or less rearrange a lot of the episodes from the middle of Apocalypse Now. You could kind of chop them up and shuffle them around quite a bit, and in some cases it probably wouldn't even be that noticeable, you know. So there are a number of episodes that were filmed that were, you know, I mean, you couldn't exactly say, well, there was a valid reason to cut them so much as saying they make the points just as well as the ones that were in the film.
Yeah.
Although, I've got to admit, this is my, as I think we talked about, Graham, my slight, I don't know, Mandela effect moment of the monkey boat scene.
Yeah.
It's not in the new cut either.
No.
But there is a famous scene, well, there's not a famous scene, there's a kind of urban legend of a scene where Willard and his crew pass by another boat that is crewed entirely by monkeys. And I thought this scene had been in Apocalypse Now Redux, but apparently it wasn't. And it hasn't been restored here either in the new final cut. It's watchable as an extra.
Yes, yeah.
So I'll give it immediate 5-star review to the monkey boat scene where they pass by a boat crewed by monkeys. I mean, it's also a boat with like mutilated corpses on it.
But the monkeys are the.
But it has a spectacular. I mean, this is a legit review of this Blu-ray, really, because the amount of extras on it is absolutely enormous, and it does have the monkey boat scene, a very important extra in my view. And one of the officers on it turns and says to Willard when they see this boat full of monkeys drifting past them, just says, "Yeah, that's come from where we're going to." Which I thought was a brilliant kind of just like, it's like a vision of the future, basically. The crew is going upriver as humans and is going to come back downriver as monkeys and mutilated corpses, which really is not a lot less mad than what really happens. But you can see in a way some of those deleted scenes, you can say, well, that's pretty entertaining. It's rather kind of heavy-handed, and you could say the film doesn't really need it, and there's quite a bit of other material like that. And a lot of people felt that way about the Redux cut, but the bit that tends to attract the most controversy, like you said, Graham, is the plantation scenes.
Yeah.
Which were the scenes of the kind of French colonists.
Mm.
And this kind of scene where Willard stops off and has dinner with a load of slightly upper-class French people in the middle of the story who live on a plantation sort of within the war zone.
Yeah.
So it just kind of stops off to go to a dinner party, and it's all, in a way, quite civilized.
Mm.
And it was in the Redux cut, and a lot of people thought it was kind of ridiculous that it was in there, and it seemed slightly out of place and jarring, which I don't know if it does jar that badly. I mean, it hasn't been removed again. It's still there in the final cut version, and I think they've maybe shortened it a bit. And it does seem to divide opinion among Apocalypse Now fans quite strongly, but it has this thing where suddenly Willard and some random people he's just met are actually having this in-depth conversation and argument about war and colonialism in like Southeast Asia.
Yeah. Instead
of just kind of going outside and being involved in it.
Yeah, I do.
So you get a sort of, you get a little kind of excerpt of director's commentary really in the middle of the film. So I don't find it especially jarring really. But you could argue again, sort of maybe slightly unnecessary, and you could still, I don't know. The other thing the thing that's great about it that's atmospheric is the suggestion that actually maybe they're just supposed to be ghosts, which is that more or less, he's arrived at the ghosts of French colonialism in the region and has found a kind of haunted house.
Yeah.
And just meets some ghosts and talks to them, and then they proceed along on their journey, which I thought is quite an interesting idea, and isn't it quite cool that would be an ambiguous interpretation, a kind of vaguely sort of supernatural thing that happens almost. So you could kind of say just between supernatural and psychological. Although it's, the impact of it there is slightly softened by the fact that Willard, in voiceover, suggests the idea himself and says, "Oh, it's almost like I suddenly wandered into a haunted house full of ghosts and was talking to them about the Vietnam War and all the things that it means." So it's kind of like, well, I don't think it's a bad scene at all. On the other hand, the movie could probably have survived without it. But then on the other hand, the final cut is now down to 3 hours. Quite a few scenes have been cut. The more scenes with the Playboy bunnies have been cut again.
Yeah, I think the logic behind that, which I do kind of see, is that they were the only scenes in Redux that didn't have Willard present for them, so it kind of takes you out of his perspective at an odd moment.
Yeah, so that's quite a good observation and quite a good reason for kind of removing it. I mean, on the other hand, the only thing lost there is it does illustrate yet another kind of aspect to the general madness. It doesn't really mess up the actual kind of sort of road movie structure of it. I think in a way it wouldn't have broken the immersion that badly. Although there is another aspect of it, which is maybe is a bit of a glib thing to keep pointing out about these classic movies, like pointing it out about Lawrence of Arabia. But the Playboy Bunnies are basically the only women in Apocalypse Now. There's one or two at the French Plantation as well. Yeah. But generally speaking, Apocalypse Now is pretty much more or less completely about men, or almost completely, and is a pretty hard fail for the Bechdel test of women being present or named or speaking to each other.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's, well, depending on how much weight you want to attach to that, it's kind of like, well, you could say it succeeds at the most astonishing things, but in that respect kind of fails at the basics. But on the other hand, it's hardly unique in kind of epic war movies in that way.
Yeah.
There's also there are kind of extensions to the surfing scenes, some of the attack scenes, some bits, cut in or taken out, very, very minor changes, which I think you'd have to be a real devotee, to be honest, or really quite, examining the detail of the Redux cut in the original. I'm sort of left wondering really what they expect exactly to get out of it, except that it's now half an hour shorter again.
I think it's just one of those things where it's marketed on definitiveness, isn't it? It's like, this is absolutely Coppola's vision.
Yeah, and that's reasonable, and I kind of, in a way, on that basis, I have no hesitation in recommending it, of saying you get this Blu-ray box set, and it contains the final cut now at 3 hours, which is probably superior to the original and superior to Redux. It's only, you can only say that in very general terms. If you apply that on any of the amazing criteria, thematically, in terms of the production or the actors and performances, it's almost too complex a question, really, of what it is that makes Apocalypse Now so great.
Yeah.
Or such a classic of this genre. And it's like, well, yeah, some things of that have been tweaked and some haven't. You may find you prefer it. I think there's a good chance you will, really. Yeah. On the other hand, the idea of watching all three of them back to back, if you see what I mean, to see which one worked the best, I don't even know if I don't know if psychologically I could cope with that, quite honestly. I think I'd just be left to kind of vegetative state.
But now you can, can't you? Because they're all included on this new set.
Yes, that's true. They're all on this new box set. And the other aspect I wanted to cover is that there's sufficient extras. It also includes the documentary Heart of Darkness, or Hearts of Darkness.
Yeah.
Which is a well-known documentary about the making of Apocalypse Now, and is one which tells the kind of story of how bizarre and bad things got on the set, and all the extreme peculiarities that happened and the strange events.
Yeah.
And how deranged, seemingly, the cast and crew got. Although, to tell you the truth, I'm sure it makes very entertaining viewing for anyone who's a fan of Apocalypse Now, I kind of ended up thinking, yeah, that documentary is possibly, where all the kind of rumours and the sort of myths about the weirdness and the madness of the production actually come from. And I didn't find a lot of it all that convincing. In a funny sort of way, it's like them saying, well, all right, there's some aspects of it are pretty legit, which is that they had a fleet of helicopters for the production of the film that they borrowed off the Philippine army.
Yeah.
Which was also fighting a war at the same time.
Yes.
So, more or less, the production of Apocalypse Now was overlapping with a real war pretty closely in a way, which is that the helicopters, were on set one day being used for filming fictional war scenes, and then the next day were off somewhere actually fighting in a war, and then later on would come back. But it's also the kind of thing where Francis Ford Coppola, in extensive interviews, comes off as a very, very brilliant and kind of aware of the implications and all the thematic resonances and everything like that in the film. And it seems clear that he really did have this amazing vision from the start, and eventually came up very, very, amazingly managed to fulfill it. But then on the other hand, it has also got scenes where it make him look like a complete knob, really, which is sort of like, well, like the French plantation scene where they're pouring wine for the characters, and he's micromanaging down to the level of saying, look, if this was white wine that the characters were drinking, it can't be cool. It's got to be closer to room temperature. It would have been left to stand for an additional hour or something like that. And it's like, would we really have noticed the difference in the temperature of the wine in the glasses at the table in the dingy dinner party version on the plantation? So it's sort of like, well, partly you could possibly put the the inconvenience and the problems on the set of Apocalypse Now down to everyone's engagement with mad kind of visions of death and so on that are inherent in the themes of the film, or you could just put it down to the fact that he, for some reason, was trying to micromanage every single detail as if it was going to drive things wrong and make things go wrong and drive everyone else out of any kind of creative process. But then I suppose in a way he ran up against Brando, who would do essentially exactly the same thing. You know, Brando would come along and kind of insist on inventing his own film, really.
Coppola also never wears a shirt, which I thought was his greatest crime here.
Oh, well, yeah. I'd forgotten about that aspect, yeah. Doesn't seem to, anyway. I wonder what exactly... I don't know if he's channeling some animal energy or something that he thinks...
Yeah, you can't type with too much fabric. It just completely gets in the way of the creativity.
Yeah. On the other hand, Marlon Brando spends the whole time in like a kind of giant black moo-moo sort of thing.
Yes.
Having more or less refused to customise his appearance for the film. They said you've got to lose a certain amount of weight, you've got to make yourself look this kind of size for the film, and he didn't. So he was quite overweight. I mean, yeah, but on the other hand, it's like, well, he just looked like a kind of middle-aged man, and they still made all of the scenes with him pretty effective, really, because he spent half his time, you know, in shadow.
Yeah.
Kind of looming out of the darkness. But he also said a lot of odd dialogue that they kind of improvise between them on the set that comes across as legitimately quite mad in some ways. Yeah, like you're left with the opinion, you know, with this strange figure of Colonel Kurtz that it's sort of like, well, was he completely insane, or have he actually, you know, seen something more clearly than everyone else did? Which of course is part of the point and the ambiguity of the film, I suppose.
Yeah.
So I don't know if there's any more to say than that, really. I mean, it's superb, of course it is. What can you possibly expect? It's the sort of thing where you might find it's just a kind of slightly tighter version of the experience than the Redux cut was. On the other hand, there's a lot of very interesting material in there that wasn't in the original, in the cinematic version. I don't know if do you think any of our listeners are in the right age bracket to have
seen
watched the original at the cinema when it came out?
I think we'll have a few listeners who were, yeah.
So if you've got a Blu-ray player, that is Apocalypse Now, the final cut, so to speak.
Yeah.
Although whether we should believe that, by the way, as well, I don't know. I mean, it seems like Francis Ford Coppola could probably live for another 20 years. So 20 years from now, that'd be 2039 or thereabouts, 2040 near enough.
Yeah.
There could be an additional cut of it on whatever amazing format of sort of laser crystal, sort of telepathic transmission we'll be using at that point.
The even finaler cut.
At which point it will be presumably absolutely trivial, even using one's phone, to completely digitally re-edit the film, just while sitting in the bath.
I think he would probably like that. Well, coming up next week, we've got not one but two new releases with Adam Driver in, which I think is always good news. I like Adam Driver. But
what are those then?
Well, if you're an Adam Driver fan who wants to save his money, you should probably know that the first one, The Report, a film about the whistleblowers who exposed the CIA torture program during the War on Terror, is out at cinemas. However, Marriage Story, in which he co-stars with Scarlett Johansson and Laura Dern, is out at cinemas next week, but will be out on Netflix, I believe, the first week in December. So, one can be held off. Yeah. In terms of the big releases, we've got two that I think are going to overshadow everything else. We've got the film that was once called Ford versus Ferrari, Le Mans 66, where we ask, can plucky Matt Damon break into the motor racing industry with nothing but the wealth of the world's most advanced and highly funded motor company behind him?
Yeah.
It's a real Goliath versus slightly different Goliath story.
Yeah.
We've got Last Christmas, Paul Feig's and Emma Thompson's bizarrely Wham-themed collaboration with Emilia Clarke and Henry Golding.
Yeah, that looked like... Well, you probably know what you're getting into if you go to see that, right? I mean...
I would say so, yeah.
On your own head, be it.
Yeah. Cinema Eclectica takes no responsibility for any injuries that may result from your cinematic choices. We have 2040, Damon Gamio's attempt to answer the question, can you make an environmental-themed documentary that doesn't make everyone feel dreadful on the way out? Reportedly, kind of succeeds. And we've got the film that we'll be doing as Film of the Week next week, which is Little Monsters, the Australian horror comedy starring Josh Gad and Lupita Nyong'o, who appears to be having just the most fun doing horror movies at the moment. So, yes, until next week when we're back with Little Monsters, that's been your lot from Eclectica. I've been Graham.
And I've been Tim.
And that other dude was Mick. He's great. Pour one out for Mick. And see you next week.